My dog is still adjusting to short walks and whatnot. Let's see here. Well, maybe we can, let's see, I guess, I'm not sure. Maybe we can advance the, okay. As an introduction, as I expect we all know, in the US, gun violence is a major public health problem. Guns are deeply ingrained in American society and the nation's political debates. Gun violence affects all communities, rural and urban, young and old, and all races. There's very little consensus about what our responses might be. And I don't know if you'd like to, maybe I'll see if this is working. There we go. If you'd like to address this, or Jeff, or would you like?
Just a little background about, can you hear me?
No.
Test. There we go. Okay. Yeah, I want to second what Ben said. Thank you for your presence here this morning. The impetus.
Your mic is facing away from you. Sorry, I'm
Better? There's a lot behind my ears. Hearing aids, glasses, and this.
In contrast to me, I have a little between my ears, above my ears,
Okay.
or behind my ears.
I should preface my presentation by saying that if you see me staggering off balance, it's not because I had a few too many last night. On New Year's Eve, I came down with vertigo, and I'm still in the recovery process. Okay. Test. Okay. Yeah, like I was saying, I'm still in the recovery process and have nausea and dizziness and still fighting some imbalance. But the heart of my part of this is to look at the draft draft of a social message pertaining to gun violence and trauma. And I asked Pam in the office to make 20 copies of this document. There's this, I see some on the table yet if you don't have one, but I thought you'd take a look at that. And I'm going to walk you through it quickly and make some comments about it. Pastor Blake notified me that this message was available for congregations, pastors, members of congregations to respond to by the end of January. So my goal today, Ben's goal today, is to familiarize you with this draft statement so that it might help you in reading through it, and after each section you are invited to give some responses. Just fill in the circles, it's pretty easy. And so I think with some introduction into this, I hope it will be helpful to you. After Pastor Blake sent it to me, I read through it and decided to convene a group of other clergy who may have an interest. Some of the pastors I invited are retired and have worked with me on the Safe Surrender event. Jerry Tews makes the handles for me. He's a pastor in Stoughton for the hand trowels that I fashion out of shotgun barrels. And George Carlson, he's also living in Stoughton, is a member of Covenant Lutheran, but he retired as a bishop of our synod. And and he's helped with a number of gun surrenders as well. Pastor Blake Rohr participated in that session, and Cindy Crane, the director of Lutheran Office of Public Policy, and also one non-clergy person was there was Ben, and who I think brings a wonderful perspective with his background as a professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and he really drove into it and had very valuable information to share with us. A word about social messages and social statements. The ELCA has about a dozen social statements and about 15 social messages. I would say the social statements have more gravity in that they provide a framework for the ELCA in the formation of policy and also for dealing with issues in our society. The ELCA churchwide statements are approved in churchwide assembly, and they take about a 5-year process to begin and bring it to an ending. The first ELCA social statement had to do with abortion, and that was back in either late 80s or early 90s. A social message, which we are looking at, they may be initiated at churchwide assemblies, but their final approval is not at a churchwide assembly. Churchwide assembly means representatives, voting members of every synod, 65 synods in the ELCA, consisting of geographical areas, gather in assembly and vote upon, debate, consider, vote upon these. The social messages are not approved by churchwide assembly. Rather, they're approved by the churchwide council. It's a lot of bureaucratic talk here. And that is a group that comes together representing each of the synods. And it includes lay people as well as clergy. I'm going to preface my remarks by saying that my initial reaction to the draft was strongly negative. And I'm glad I've had a couple months to kind of sit with it and read it through a few more times. And so I left at that. And I've, in the process, come to some self-awarenesses that, for me, bring a little measure of humility to addressing it instead of being really fire and brimstone about it. And I've come to a few insights about my own
I find
self-awareness.
this presentation
Number
so
one,
boring.
it's easier to critique someone else's work than to author your own work. I'm really good at that. For years, I was the
I think
chair
everybody's muted.
committee at Synod assemblies, and I love tearing into resolutions and working through them before they went to the floor of the Synod assembly. And I've learned to be a very good critic. Number two, I recognize my own deep formation and convictions that play into my disappointments of this draft. About 6 years ago now, I really came to see that my work with safe surrender and firearm violence prevention was for me a calling. And at that time, for me, that meant digging into becoming as well informed as possible about the issues pertaining to gun violence, and specifically in addressing congregations, perspectives and bringing this issue to congregations because I don't think it's being discussed and wrestled with and struggled with as it should be. I'll say pastors by and large tend to shy away from it, are timid about addressing it. I'm sure for fear of pushback by members of congregations. I have a box or a big bag of books that I've read, and I've noticed that the document that we're looking at consists of like 55 or 65 footnotes, which I think says it's well researched and a well, the writer of it, who worked with 2 consultants, really did his homework. But I noticed that we are not looking at many textbooks that I think really look more deeply into the issue. Number 3, my own self-awareness. This is a draft and not a finished product. And we are gracefully given the opportunity to give our input into something that is in process. And having said that, as I've thought about it, I would never want to show anything to anybody that I have ever written that's the first draft. One friend of mine, retired pastor, he was helpful to me in talking about his struggle with forming a sermon, that the first draft is called a crummy first draft, although that's not really the word there. That frees you up to just put yuck down on
There
paper.
he is.
Then you work with that.
Oh,
and
but you
go
got yourself on there.
I'm aware
Get
that
yourself
this is
off of there.
a product. It's a
Or
draft.
cover up that thing.
So the goal is to familiarize you with the draft.
You
And
want
so
to
I'm
get
just going
yourself
to
off.
quickly point out how this is constructed for you as we walk
You
through
can
it.
sit down and move
There
this
is a
volume
preface,
off here for a second.
3 main parts, and a conclusion. It's almost like we were taught to write sermons in seminary. You have an introduction, 3 main points, and a conclusion. But the preface addresses the question. I've noticed as I worked through this most recently, there are questions throughout it that are not in bold type, I wish they were, that this draft is trying to address. The first question is, what societal trends and new understandings call the ELCA to witness anew? So this is trying to bring it current to what's gone on in the past 20 years since the last social message was drafted. And so it talks about the growing and disparate violence and pervasive insecurity. By pervasive insecurity, I think the word is fear. The fearfulness of strangers, of gun violence in our, as individuals and as a society. And then also seeing trauma and seeking protection. Now, that gets into, I think, what's newest in the development of this draft is the concept of trauma. That's part 1. And it is not the largest section of the draft, it's the second largest. But in our group that we convened of clergy, there were people, several people talked about, maybe there's a bit much on trauma here. It's a big part of the whole section. And could that be somehow be made more concise in addressing it? So it talks about what is gun-related trauma and addresses a whole number of points on that. There are forms and relations to gun trauma, powerlessness and trauma, anticipatory trauma, and defensive responses, gun suicide and survivor trauma, criminal homicide and community trauma, public mass shootings, and the violence trauma cycle. And so it really highlights those. What it doesn't mention is, what if we're not deeply traumatized or even mildly traumatized? I'm not sure I can say I've been traumatized by gun violence, even though I've been deeply influenced by presiding at least a half a dozen funerals where death was by suicide with a handgun. And I have seen the traumatic effects upon families and loved ones of the person who is deceased. But I've been deeply influenced. I'm not sure I've been traumatized by that. But my reaction to mass shootings, especially when children are involved, is one of deep anger. I think another child sacrificed on the altar of the gun empire. And so I feel a lot of anger and frustration with the fact that people are toting around AR-15s, which were developed for the purpose of the soldiers fighting in Vietnam. And they are not useful for anything else other than killing people. And so, my own anger at the gun empire, the manufacturers, the shooter, however that came into the person's hands. So part 2 has with countering violence and trauma as God's resolve for peace. I really like the framework that this draft statement is working from, is that it's addressing gun violence and trauma is an illustration or rises out of the framework of peacemaking. Now, the ELCA does have a statement on peacemaking, and so if we were really to study the issue, I think we'd want to look at what the ELCA says about peacemaking. But I also think we want to look at our own selves and say, how do we image Jesus? And I'm thinking of a sermon Pastor Katie preached just at the end of the Pentecost season this fall that talked about Peter having the mistaken image or understanding of who Jesus is and needing a different understanding or vision of who Jesus is. I've been probing that and plan to do so this winter in thinking about Jesus as a peacemaker. We have dominant images of the ways Jesus has been imaged through the Christian church for centuries. And the way we image Jesus and understand who Jesus is the way that we are influenced by the Spirit of Jesus and the way we pray to Jesus. So I'm most interested in Jesus as peacemaker and his calling for peacemaking. Notice the wall up there, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. So it's a part of the fabric of who we are as a Christian church. So I like the fact that this is seen in the broader context of peacemaking. The question is, what is the societal teaching of the ELCA on gun-related violence? The ELCA has some teachings that are helpful, and it also asks the question, how does love of neighbor advance peacemaking today? Living in the neighbor through love. A shared responsibility beyond liberal individualism. Now we hear many people in our world are rugged individualists. And by liberal individualism here, we do not mean liberal politically. We mean people who don't want to be told what to do by government. Okay? So strong adherence of the Second Amendment as a reason for gun ownership, that they are examples of liberal individualism. Another question, can a Christian be a defensive gun owner? This is, I feel, a disappointing area of this document in that it says the ELCA has really not dealt with that question. I think, the whole question of defensive gun ownership, it has to do with buying a firearm for self-protection and the willingness to use it to protect oneself. It doesn't, I ask people, what are the ethics of self-defense? And I'm not getting good answers from a faith perspective at this point. What we do know is Jesus never talked about self-defense. Jesus talked a lot about self-sacrifice and servanthood. So I wish that would be dealt with in depth. Part 3 is toward a shared responsibility of what makes for peace. And this section I appreciate somewhat, and because it looks at gun violence and trauma as a societal broad base. This is the largest portion of the entire draft of the document. Interestingly, though, and it talks about, it addresses efforts by journalists and news organizations and how the news might sensationalize a mass killing and what their responsibility is. And I say, okay for that. It doesn't say anything, though, about how the media might be helpful in promoting less gun violence. And I come from a perspective where even though the media is unhelpful in promoting safe surrender events, they show up the day of and they report, and I've been surprised at the kind of coverage they've given to safe surrender events, and I really appreciate that a lot. It talks about the responsibility of thought leaders. I get a kick out of this one. Who are the thought leaders? I think they're referring to our elected representatives. It doesn't deal at all, though, with the influence of big money, the influence of the lobbyist who will support gun rights, peacemaking of law enforcement and the role that law enforcement has, peacemaking of healthcare providers and public health professionals. And I appreciate that. People are saying we need to talk about this as a public health issue. Community development and social ministry organizations, the work of gun violence researchers. Ben and I were talking beforehand about how the money was cut off at one time and for doing research in this area, and how it's necessary to provide more funding for violence researchers. I think the strength of this area, and I really appreciate this one, peacemaking of gun owners and shooting associations, of trying to bring those organizations and individuals on board to participate in the discussion and formation about safe gun storage and handling and use of firearms. Unfortunately, it doesn't mention having firearm shows. If you read the State Journal, there's hardly a week goes by that there isn't a firearm show somewhere in southern Wisconsin. And if you've ever been to one of those events, they're it's a different culture. And I think, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a booth set up at those events that would promote safe storage and use of firearms? Talks about the responsibility of firearm manufacturers. It doesn't talk about they're in it for the money, and they want to sell guns. They have been immune from the law, and that's changed somewhat with Sandy Hook, but they've gotten away with a lot. Particular concerns of the AR-15 style at the time of this writing: peacemaking of gun control and gun rights advocacy groups, peacemaking of civic engagement. I think it's a real balanced section, and I appreciate that a lot. It doesn't demonize gun owners, nor does it deify gun owners or gun ownership. And so, but the weakest section, I think, is what are the distinctive responsibilities of faith communities in peacemaking? And it mentions bridging divides, cultivating grace, building community, advocating policy, healing trauma. I think it's woefully inadequate. I do what I do because I believe the Lutheran Church, Christian Church, has a lot to offer in God's message that can curb and restrain gun violence. And I believe God's love revealed in Christ Jesus, heard and received and dwelt upon, transforms people's lives. And if we can approach it addressing the hearts and minds of one another and people in the community, in the country, I believe that transformation occurs. Advocacy, of course, is always important, but I believe we have the biblical word that I believe has been neglected in this whole discussion of the issue. So I'm going to just offer my own feedback. One being on, it comes down, I think, to one question. Is this draft message helpful? Is it helpful? If I developed a scale with, you can fill in your little dot here, being not helpful at all, somewhat helpful, neutral, to somewhat helpful, to extremely helpful, I would say it's mildly helpful. And this is the reason. I'm not sure it addresses the real questions that we're asking, or I'm hearing being asked. Namely, the prophetic task in this whole question, I think, is neglected in the document. And I mean prophetic task about renouncing that which is anti-God, anti-life. The task of naming idolatry. There was a Presbyterian scholar named James Atwood who died a couple years ago, who's written several books on guns, and he talks about gun idolatry or fundamentalism, and where the gun ownership is elevated to such a platform where people believe it's my God-given right to own firearms. That's gun idolatry. And nowhere does Scripture say it's your God-given right to own firearms, unless you elevate the Constitution and Second Amendment and say it has the same authority as Scripture does. Then you can say it, but I don't believe the Constitution Amendment is that authoritative. It doesn't renounce false teaching. Then we'll mention the myths. It doesn't name the forces of evil. Are we contending with principalities and powers, as Paul describes, that are greater than ourselves in this whole thing? It doesn't really talk about the power of the NRA, which has been very powerful and influential. It doesn't mention the NRA. About the power and the money, the economics that are described. It doesn't reference the question about what about members who are carrying concealed weapons into the worship setting. We talk about welcoming all people. I don't know if I want to welcome someone who is sitting next to me with a firearm. And it doesn't address that kind of issue of bringing a firearm into the sanctuary. Now that's worth pondering. Firearms in the sanctuary is meant to be a sacred and safe place for all people. And we may feel that doesn't happen at Midvale, but when I started this exploration process, one of my childhood friends who still is living in Beaver Dam, still attends First Lutheran Church, disclosed to me that he carries a handgun to worship, just to keep everybody safe. He's a good guy with a gun. And I did a 3-month part-time interim at this little Lutheran church down in Brooklyn a few years back. And 2 days before the pastor there went on sabbatical, she said, oh, by the way, there's a couple little old ladies who bring firearms in their purses to worship. And, you know, what do you do at 2 days' notice? But, you know, it's there. Nan has a cousin and her husband who live in Texas. And Craig says, I think about half the people there bear firearms, and it's mostly the women. You know, what about the ethics of that and addressing that kind of issue? So I think there desperately needs to provide ethical guidance for defensive gun use, self-protection. What we have most helpful are the laws that are in place, but they're sketchy, I think, and terribly subjective. If you feel threatened, you may shoot someone. That might be a little exaggeration. But what if that person is a Black person and you have some preconceived notions about being fearful of Black people? You know, so I think race plays into it as well. There's no mention of forging ecumenical and interfaith relationships with congregations or hosting gun surrenders as a witness to the community to talk about safe surrender. If we have the freedom to purchase firearms, we also have the freedom to surrender them. And the Second Amendment isn't mentioned at all in this document, which I don't know why not. You know, certainly it's referred to. You can make the connections, but you know, why not encourage congregations to really study the Second Amendment and why we differ so much on our understanding of it. So those are my comments. Again, I hope familiarizing you with the document, you will go home and read through it and respond by the end of January. And I'd be appreciative of hearing if you do respond to it. Thank you. Okay, Ben, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jeff. And, you know, one of the things that we've talked about thought would be helpful to provide a little bit of background, because To the extent that we, as a congregation, want to be proactive and do something, I think it's important, the first step is to be informed. One of the things that we seem to have entered what I would call the post-truth era of life, where while we seem to have more and more outlets and vehicles to obtain information, it seems to be more of a challenge to find information that appears to be fact-based and accurate. In any event, let's start with the Second Amendment. A little bit of history. Some of you might recall that our first effort to sort of face the challenge of having a strong national government while respecting the individual autonomy of the colonies, the first states, was the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation failed because they did not provide for a strong federal government. Some of their failings were there was no central leadership, there was no legislative or executive power to enforce laws, no power to tax, no power to regulate trade or to have a national court system. And with that failed experiment, the Constitutional Convention was convened in 1787, dominated by a group called the Federalists. And basically, they believed that the Constitution as written was an inadequate document to move forward with this new system of balanced government and power between states and federal government. The Anti-Federalists were very concerned, primarily states' rights, that certain individual rights would be overcome by the federal government, and they pushed for a Bill of Rights. James Madison, the primary author, believed that a Bill of Rights would be sort of throwing a bone, if you will, to the Anti-Federalists to gain their support, but wanted to structure it in a way that he didn't feel that it interfered or impaired or changed the meaning of the Constitution. The Second Amendment was something that found its way into the Bill of Rights. I have the text of it there, and for those grammaticians would realize that, when you have a sentence, all words in it should be given meaning. And the first clause provides a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, which basically what follows is limited, if you will, or defined or clarified by the first phrase, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There was great debates, and I won't go into detail about them, about whether or not a specific individual right to bear arms or possess guns was part of the Constitution. And the Federalists resisted that and refused to include that. In fact, one of the things, late Justice Scalia, who was viewed as the darling of the right, some of the things that he cited in the case which recognized the right to bear arms are simply wrong. For example, he cited the proposal in the Virginia Constitution that was presented to have a right to bear arms as part of the state constitution. It was rejected by Virginia. And so in any event, neither the text of the Constitution nor the subsequent Bill of Rights make any mention whatsoever of an individual right to bear arms. Partly because of concerns about slaves in the South owning weapons and whatnot, there was great resistance to having an individual right recognized. And basically, the right to bear arms for more than 200 years, 217 years to be exact, was viewed as basically a settled legal question. That is, the right to bear arms applied only if connected to a state militia, which was meant to protect against federal overreach or foreign invasions and whatnot. Only 2 of the original 13 colonies did incorporate in their own state constitutions a right to bear arms, Vermont and Pennsylvania. And also government regulation was viewed as certainly part and parcel of the powers of the federal government. What happened? Where did we get? Well, for more than 200 years, the Supreme Court followed the original intent. In a case, U.S. versus Miller, a unanimous court upheld the National Firearms Act, which was to regulate Tommy guns, for those of you who like watching the old gangster movies. And in fact, a very conservative Chief Justice, Warren Burger, stated, and I quote, when asked about NRA claims that the Second Amendment guaranteed an individual right to possess guns, he said, "This is one of the greatest pieces of fraud. I repeat the word fraud in the American people by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime." He was one of the most conservative jurists to have been on the Supreme Court in the last 150 years. However, beginning with the Reagan administration, conservative efforts existed to rewrite the Constitution and the history under the guise of originalism, to claim that the Second Right guaranteed an individual right to possess guns. There was coordinated efforts by the NRA, the Federalist Society, which screened and vetted appointees to the federal courts to limit those that adhered to a certain vision of revisionist history. And that resulted in the decisions of District of Columbia versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago. Both decided, if you will, by a single vote. And for the first time in 217 years, those decisions recognized an individual right to bear arms. That said, language is imprecise. That is the law as we exist, but the historical record is certainly bare. What options exist? Even in the Heller decision, the court acknowledged that government had the right to basically regulate gun ownership. And this would be who can own guns, what type of guns can be owned, what type of ammunition can be sold and whatnot. And there's more than 50% public support has been for some time to government regulation. Here we list some of the various things that suggest are vehicles that could make gun ownership safer. I won't go through the various details on them. Let's see here. Myths about guns, and maybe I can go through this kind of quickly and whatnot. These are common arguments that we've all heard. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. A good guy with a gun is the best protection against a bad guy with a gun. Guns keep us safe, stranger danger, enforce current laws, slippery slope. Well, number one, basically most gun deaths, number one, the leading type of gun death we have right now is suicide. And none of these arguments are responsive to that and things that might be possible to eliminate that particular risk. People that commit suicide or attempt to do so with guns are 95% successful. Other means of committing suicide are typically less than 5% successful. And so an impulsive moment, a poor choice, will have irreversible effects. But in any event, there's a great deal of literature about why none of these arguments basically are sort of, if you will, factually based. This is something I think that merits, and one of the benefits of agreeing and having the opportunity to work with Jeff, and I guess I'd also give a shout out and thank him for his contributions and passion on this issue, which I think has enriched all of our experiences and knowledge. It's caused me to look into this a little bit more deeply than I might have otherwise, even though I've dealt with some of this in my sort of other life. And in looking at the conservative perspective, like what are some of the impediments? Well, number one, there is a deep-seated lack of faith in government, the deep state, the notion that government is not capable of protecting us from each other, and therefore that responsibility lies with us as individuals. As Jeff mentioned, gun ownership symbolizes freedom and individualism, and the notion that any interference with that is therefore consequently an interference with our freedom and our basic rights. There's a religious dimension, and there's a great deal of research on this. Many of the most outspoken white evangelicals that support gun rights claim to be white evangelicals, but are not regular churchgoers or active in their various congregations. And they proudly identify as white Christian nationalists. Jeff touched upon this. Many of them have, as part of the revisionist history, believe that basically that we are a Christian nation, that Madison, Washington, Jefferson were all Christians, and that the Constitution, rather than a document written by humans, is perhaps somewhat like the Quran in that it's the word of God that's passed through men and expressed in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. No historical support for that, but that is a belief that is embraced by some of the most outspoken gun advocates. What does that mean? That means that the Second Amendment, the right to own guns, is a God-given right that can't be taken away by any secular actions. And therefore, that elevates that right to a natural right. There is also selective quotes from the Bible in many of the evangelical writings that says not only does the Bible guarantee a right to own guns, it imposes upon each of you a duty to own a gun because of the biblical responsibility to protect family and innocence. And the belief that there is supernatural evil in the world, and the idea that gun violence is not a result of social structures or mechanisms, but individual evilness, again, is used to argue that the only way we can combat that is by having guns. And one thing we all hear, I think, are often frustrated when there's a mass shooting or something that all our politicians are able to do is say we express thoughts and prayers. Well, that and having a gun, and the idea that gun violence is proof of evil in the world, and the solution is thoughts and prayers and basically a greater presence of God in the public and public schools and whatnot. Some of this I didn't really understand as well, and there's a great deal out there, and this is a belief that is embraced and certainly is sort of like inherent in those that support guns. And I think reaching out to this group and whatnot has to understand and at least respect their points of view and whatnot. Legislative actions. Now, I mentioned before that even with the high watermark of gun rights with Heller and McDonald and the conservative court, they did acknowledge that gun regulation is still okay. Now, there's some questions in the more recent Brown case, which I'm not going to go into, but in any event, what's the history? Well, one thing I've found in my work in criminal justice is that oftentimes broadening the view of homicides or family violence or sexual assault as not just a criminal law problem, but as a public health problem, and try to understand what conditions create a greater risk of certain things happening, it often gives us better tools, a better understanding of problems, and allows us to take preventative action. Because, you know, one of the things when you think about when we talk about catch bad guys and throw them in jail, typical criminal justice responses to inappropriate behavior occurs after the harm has already occurred. And so are there better ways to think about things to create situations where the harm may not occur at all? Well, in any event, we started to look at gun violence as sort of a public health issue in the early 1990s. The Center for Disease Control and the National Institute of Health had some researches. The Kellerman study in '93, not surprisingly, discovered that the presence of gun in homes increased the likelihood of gun injuries, accidents, kids getting a hold of them, and the like. That was opposed vigorously by the gun industry and gun lobbyists and many of the conservative legislators. And a House of Representatives, a person named Dickey from Arkansas in '96, added an amendment which was overwhelmingly approved by Congress to prohibit any federal funding of public health research on gun violence. Completely eliminate it. Now, any of those that have fed from the public trough, as I have over the years, it's fairly thin gruel, but it's steady and whatnot. Realize that if you take away federal funding, you don't research anything because there's not a lot of private foundations and private money for this. And so for about 20 years, we had no public health research in this area. And those few intrepid public health doctors that sought to do this tried to cobble different data together and whatnot with great difficulty. So there was a dearth of helpful research. That changed slightly after Sandy Hook in 2018. And if we think about the lobbying, Jeff had mentioned this, in 2022, the pro-gun groups and the NRA spent more than $16 million on lobbying and providing support and cash contributions to members, elected officials in state and Congress that supported gun rights. The Brady group and other gun regulation groups spent only $3 million on lobbying, reflecting obviously a pretty stark difference in resources available. Right now, if one would try to introduce certain bills, they don't even get out of committee. They're not voted upon and whatnot, even though there continues to be overwhelming public support for stuff, for gun regulations. A couple of facts I'll go through kind of quickly. We basically have more guns than people in the United States. There's basically 120 guns for every 100 Americans. We have 46% of all the guns in the world in the US, almost 400 million guns. 20% of the sales are unregulated. These are the loopholes online, flea markets and the like. And so any regulations about somebody with a criminal record or the like that buy their guns, and even dumb criminals. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to go to a gun shop and have it get turned down and have to wait 3 days? Or do you go online or the flea market? So I was somewhat surprised that the amount, the estimates of unregulated gun sales was that low. Handguns are the most popular. Now, half of the guns owned are owned by 3% of the adult population, and 8% own 10 or more guns, which is sort of interesting. Now, I'll give a quick disclaimer. I had a 2-week love affair with the Second Amendment. As the most obnoxious child that ever lived in Wisconsin, my mother, who usually had the best judgment, finally I broke her down and she bought me a BB gun. And for 2 weeks, I was the terror of the neighborhood. I shot my sister, shot cars, houses, songbirds, friends, and then Mom came to her senses and confiscated my Daisy BB gun. So, but I would also say on a more serious note, I have done a lot of criminal representation and whatnot, and many of them involve homicide with guns where bad people were in a bad situation and something really spun out of control easily because of the access of a weapon, something that would have been a broken nose or and whatnot, absent a weapon. So in any event, most gun owners are white, male, live in rural areas and identify as Republican. 40% of Americans report living in a home with a gun present. And the gun industry apparently provides $51 billion support to our economy. So it is a big industry. One of the things, and if any of you are interested in looking at websites, the Bible is used as a marketing strategy. Jeff had mentioned that, gun industry and manufacturers are interested in the money. Many of them truly believe that it is a Christian mission for them to sell their guns. And their websites quote scripture. If you would look at some of them, you might be somewhat surprised. Gun violence and statistics, there was in our country 20,000 plus homicides in 2022, outstripped by suicides. The number of injuries and whatnot are listed there. Something that got a great deal of attention for obvious reasons, but is really one of the less frequent are the mass shootings and whatnot. One of the things that's somewhat tragic, the suicides are typically young white males in rural areas where there's the least amount of gun regulation. Now, one of the things I went through somewhat quickly, and one thing I'm going to suggest as I see our time is drawing near, if it would be desired, we could easily get this PowerPoint put on the website if somebody wanted to look at it. But one of the things that Jeff and I thought would be a good idea would be to see what are some other faith traditions saying about this. and whatnot. And we downloaded, we got some different statements, some of them not as detailed as our draft, but we have something from the Catholic Church, and I'm going to go through these somewhat quickly, from the Jewish Council of Public Affairs, the Islamic Society of North America, the United Methodist Church, and we'll stop by the Southern Baptist because that'll merit a little more attention, but virtually all of the other ones suggest partnerships, if you will, and advocacy by faith communities for gun regulation. Now, something that in an era of great gerrymandering and conservative control of legislatures is a challenge, but it does suggest that all these different forms of gun regulation are very important. It also acknowledges that the government is not completely incompetent and that government can and should do more if we elect people that share that vision. Now, the Southern Baptist, and I've looked at some of this as I've researched about some of the evangelical view of guns, this is a somewhat extraordinary document. It's the first one I found, and if we look at the fourth bullet point, it asks the government to evaluate social maladies that cause violence. That's the first thing I saw that suggested that any of the evangelicals or Baptists thought government had anything to do with this. And note that if they think government is incompetent and is the deep state, and this is all individual, then one would think that the solution, and the harm is not caused by contextual situations, it's caused by evil individuals. And so to basically reduce the number of evil individuals is the solution. But in any event, the Southern Baptist, rather than talking about specific strategies, the things I pulled out is that basically killing innocents is wicked and sinful, and it's hard to argue with that. They've indicated a willingness to minister to the victims. They commended the heroism of police and first responders, asked government to evaluate social maladies, only if they don't impair the Second Amendment, of course, with that limitation, and ask gun owners to acknowledge responsibility to be mindful of sinfulness. This is their way of saying that with the right to bear guns, there is a responsibility. But the question is, how far does that go? Does that mean trigger locks? Does that mean safe storage and whatnot, making sure children don't have access to firearms? And basically, they identify as the cause of gun violence depravity, sinfulness, and wickedness of the heart, and therefore that the only true antidote or solution is not government regulations, but the gospel of Jesus Christ. And again, it's a different view. It's a view that is somewhat predominant, more in the South, but it's something I think to be aware of and think about. What is the point of commonality? What are things that people that have a different point of view can agree upon and use that as something to build and whatnot? Now, Jeff has given a very detailed, better than I could have done, sort of review of the message. And then maybe the last 2 minutes or something, I put some questions about. I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at it or if you have any reactions. And I think in addressing things about the draft, Jeff is much more capable and equipped than I am to do it. And I apologize for going through this fairly quickly, but I thought that there was a lot of ground to cover. And again, we can post the PowerPoint on the website if anybody was interested. And if somebody wants to know about other sort of literature, and there's a rich number of statistics and other books and stuff written about this. So thank you. I don't know if any other comments that you've got, Jeff? Or should we dismiss class?
Wait till we get the mic.
Where do you do the response? On the ELCA site, or where is that?
It's, I noticed last evening, it's rather easy to access if you just go on the ELCA website. It's not hard. It was harder a month ago to find the social message, but it's right there and you can read through it, and there's response after each section.
Yeah, and this is also recorded. It'll be up on the church's YouTube channel, so you could go through and pause and look at the slides that way too.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for braving the winter winds and whatnot, and stay warm and well.
You're welcome to keep the document as well. Well, great job.
I thought it worked out just fine.
Yeah,
Well, to be honest with you, I think your strength in this was